Dawn drifted slow over the plains, spilling a pale gold light that made the frost on the grass glimmer like shards of glass. The wind was barely a whisper, carrying the faint tang of wood smoke and the distant toll of a church bell that had not yet called its flock. A solitary tree stood on the hill beyond the town, skeletal in the winter air, its branches twisted like the fingers of an old hand pointing at heaven. Clara Whitfield's breath rose in fragile clouds as she crossed the meadow barefoot, a tin pail of biscuits and beans swinging from her hand. Her boots were slung over her shoulder to keep her steps soundless, though she knew the earth remembered every foot that touched it. She kept her head low, the brim of her faded straw hat shadowing the pale spill of hair the sun had not yet reached. She moved like someone walking into a promise, though her heart knew better. Beyond the ridge lay a camp of Comanche families, thin and cold, their fires little more than coals in the wind. She had seen them once while riding out for water, children wrapped in hides too small for them, faces hollowed by hunger, and something in her mother's old words had stirred like an ember catching breath. A hungry stomach has no enemy. No law could scrape that truth from her. So she rose before the rest of Whitfield's crossing, wrapped the biscuits in a flour sack, spooned the beans still warm from the stove, and slipped into the dawn as if it were a friend who would not betray her. Her fingers tightened around the pail's handle as she skirted the general store. The windows were black, but behind them lived eyes that seemed always to know. She felt them even in the silence, in the way the air stiffened around her. She kept to the narrow path behind the livery, the frost crackling faintly beneath her feet, until the ridge rose ahead, dark against the whitening sky. Somewhere beyond it, the Comanche would be stirring, the smoke from their fires lost in the same wind that tugged at her hat. She climbed the ridge, leaving her prints in the frost, and when she reached the crest, she paused. For a moment she thought she saw a lone rider far off, black against the snow-dusted earth, but the vision wavered and was gone. She pressed on. That night, the air in Lydia Carter's inn was thick with the smell of beef stew and the low murmur of men who preferred their words half-hidden. Clara sat near the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold, when the sound of her own name braided itself into their whispers. Saw her up by the ridge. Carrying something, one voice said. Another, sharper. Feeding the very devils that burned our wagons. She kept her gaze on the streaked glass, where lamplight blurred against the dark. Lydia moved behind the counter, her expression unreadable, though her hand lingered a moment on Clara's shoulder when she passed. The door swung open, letting in a slant of night air and the tall frame of Marshal Enoch Price. His boots made no sound on the worn floorboards as he crossed to her table. He removed his hat, set it on the edge, and leaned close enough that she could smell the winter dust on his coat. "Law's plain on this," he said softly. "Giving aid to the enemy is a hanging offense." His voice carried no heat, only the cool weight of someone stating the shape of a grave. Clara met his eyes and found there no room for mercy. Across the room, Daniel Hensley lifted his head, their gazes catching for a bare heartbeat before he looked away, as if shame were something that could be passed by sight alone. By morning, the whispers had grown teeth. She felt them in the way the grocer's wife paused mid-sweep to watch her pass, in the half-laughter of boys leaning on the hitching rail. The air seemed thinner, as though the town itself had decided to hold its breath until she broke. When the knock came at her door, it was not loud. She opened it to find Enoch and 2 deputies standing in the pale light. No one raised their voice, no one needed to. The cold steel of manacles closed around her wrists, the bite of the metal waking every nerve in her hands. She stepped outside and the air cut into her lungs, sharp as river ice. The 3 of them walked her through the center of Whitfield's crossing, past faces in doorways, some watching with quiet pity, most with the grim satisfaction of a law fulfilled. A stray dog followed at her heels, nails clicking on the hard ground. Somewhere behind her, someone spat. The sky had begun to change, clouds gathering slow and heavy, promising snow. She kept her eyes forward, the tree on the hill rising against the horizon like a black stitch in the earth's pale cloth. Her breath quickened, not from fear alone, but from the weight of every step carrying her farther from the place she had been only yesterday. She thought of the camp beyond the ridge, of the biscuits now eaten or gone cold, of the children who might wake today with a little less hunger. That was a kind of peace, even here. The hill's slope was gentle, but each step felt steeper than the last. The rope swayed from the branch above, its fibers pale against the dark bark, its loop like a question waiting for an answer. She had passed this tree 100 times, riding out to the meadow in spring, its branches filled with sparrows. Now it stood bare, its silence heavy. Enoch stopped a few feet from the base, the deputies stepping aside. He unrolled a slip of paper and read her crime in a voice meant for the wind to carry. Providing food and comfort to hostile Comanche persons in violation of town statute. His words drifted over the grass and were lost. Clara's eyes lifted to the horizon. The land stretched unbroken, save for the low hills to the west. She was not searching for rescue, there was no one to come. But she thought she saw a flicker of movement, far off, like a shadow breaking free from the ground. Her hands trembled in the cold. The stool was set beneath the rope, the wood worn smooth by other feet. She stepped onto it, the air at this height thinner still. The rope brushed the side of her neck, rough and smelling faintly of resin and smoke. She closed her eyes. Her breath slowed, her heartbeat loud enough to drown the murmurs below. Somewhere in the distance, a single crow called, its voice a ragged thread in the stillness. The stool shifted under her boots as someone's hand moved to kick it away. She opened her eyes just enough to see the horizon once more. The shadow she had thought a trick of the light was larger now, breaking against the snow-dusted earth in a rhythm she recognized, hoof-beats fast and unyielding drawing nearer. And in that heartbeat before the world dropped away, the cold air carried a sound she had not expected, low, sharp, and sudden, like the crack of the sky itself breaking. The sound split the air, sharp as a whip crack, and the rope above her head gave way. Clara fell hard, her knees striking frozen ground, breath ripping into her lungs in ragged, panicked bursts. The world blurred with white and shadow. Through the haze, a horse's breath steamed in the cold, nostrils flaring, its flanks shuddering beneath the weight of the rider who had come like a storm out of nowhere. He was tall in the saddle, his dark hair whipped by the wind, his rifle still smoking in his hands. The deputies hesitated only a heartbeat before scattering toward the slope, boots slipping on the frost. Marshal Enoch shouted her name, not with concern but with fury, his hand going to the revolver at his hip. The rider wheeled his horse, closing the distance with the swift certainty of a hawk falling upon prey. He reached down, his arm strong and sure, and pulled Clara onto the saddle before she could catch her breath. Her cheek brushed against the coarse wool of his coat, the heat of his body startling against the winter air. She clutched at the saddle horn as the horse lunged forward, snow and dirt flying beneath its hooves. The sound of gunfire cracked behind them, but the rider did not look back. Wind tore at Clara's hat until it was gone, her hair spilling in pale ribbons over her face. She could hear his breathing, steady despite the gallop, and feel the tension in the arm that held her firm against the saddle. The land blurred into rolling white and brown, the town falling away like a page turning to another story entirely. She tried to speak, but her voice was lost to the rush of air, swallowed by the hooves that beat the earth in a rhythm she could feel in her bones. They did not slow until the hills rose higher, breaking the wind, and the rider guided the horse into a hollow where the snow lay undisturbed. Only then did he rein in, the horse's sides heaving, steam curling from its coat. Clara's legs were weak as she slid down, the ground tilting under her, her breath still uneven. The man dismounted in one fluid motion, his movements quiet, deliberate. He was young, no older than she, yet his eyes carried the weight of something older, something worn into the bone. A small scar cut across his left cheek, pale against his skin. His gaze met hers without hesitation. He reached into a saddlebag and brought out a buffalo hide blanket, wrapping it around her shoulders without a word. The weight and warmth of it made her shiver all over again, her fingers tightening around the edges. He handed her a canteen. The water was cold and metallic, but it steadied the tremor in her chest. "Why?" she asked at last, her voice hoarse, the question as much to herself as to him. "You fed the hungry," he said simply. "The rest is noise." His voice was low, shaped by an accent she did not know but felt. He glanced toward the horizon, scanning it like a man accustomed to being hunted. For a while they said nothing. The snow seemed to swallow sound, leaving only the muted snap of the horse's tail and the faint hiss of the wind over the ridge. Clara pulled the blanket tighter, her body thawing slowly, though something inside her remained clenched, braced against the memory of the rope's burn against her neck. When they moved again, it was not back toward town but westward, tracing a narrow path between the hills. The sun had begun to lower, its light thinning to copper, painting long shadows across the snow. Clara studied him in the shifting light. The way he kept his shoulders loose but his eyes always searching. The way he touched the horse's neck when it stumbled, a quiet word easing the animal's step. She felt the silence between them changing shape, not quite comfort, but something moving toward it. They crested a rise, and below lay a cluster of low fires, their smoke pale against the snow. The Comanche camp. Children darted between the tents, their laughter carrying faintly, as fragile as birdsong in winter. Women looked up as the pair approached, some stepping forward, others watching from a distance. Clara felt the weight of their eyes, the quiet assessment in them, but there was no accusation. Only recognition. An older woman approached, her hair streaked with silver, her face lined in a way that seemed carved by wind rather than time. She studied Clara for a long moment, then reached into her own coat and drew out a necklace, simple beads strung on leather, the colors worn but still bright. She pressed it into Clara's hand with a nod. No words passed between them, but Clara understood. This was not payment, not thanks, but a joining, an unspoken thread pulled tight. The rider, Tahu, she learned when another man called his name, spoke briefly to the elders. Clara could not follow the words, but she felt their cadence, the way they glanced at her and then back at him. After a time, Tahu returned to her side. "We go back," he said. "To town." The thought scraped against her throat. "To the edge." His tone left no room for doubt. They rode in silence as dusk bled into the sky, the horizon smudged in shades of violet and steel. When the rooftops of Whitfield's Crossing appeared far off, Clara's stomach tightened. Tahu did not slow until they reached the crest of a hill that looked down on the main street. There he stopped, his gaze fixed on the cluster of figures that had gathered near the livery. Among them stood Marshal Enoch, his posture stiff, his hat low over his brow. Clara's hands tightened around the reins. She knew the risk in returning, yet something in her refused to cower at the edge of the life she had once walked without shame. Tahu dismounted first, offering his hand to steady her as she slid down. She met his eyes, and in them saw no claim, only a quiet understanding that whatever happened next was hers to choose. They walked side by side toward the town. Conversation stilled as the first faces recognized her, eyes widening, whispers blooming like weeds in the cold. Enoch stepped forward, his mouth opening, but no words came. His gaze flicked to Tahu, then back to her, and she saw in that silence a wound to his pride deeper than any rope's mark. Daniel Hensley was there too, and this time when their eyes met, he did not look away. Something in his expression had shifted, shame replaced by a tentative kind of respect. At the main street's end, Tahu paused. He looked once more at her, then turned and mounted his horse. Without a word, he rode away, the sound of hooves fading until the town's own quiet swallowed them. Clara stood for a moment, the beaded necklace warm against her palm, then walked on. Each step felt like reclaiming something she had been told was lost forever. When she reached the inn, the door opened before her, she glanced back once toward the horizon. The sky there still held the faintest trace of his shadow, as if the day had kept a piece of him for her. In the settling quiet, she understood that survival was not just the absence of death. It was the choice to walk forward, chin high, in full view of those who had tried to make you smaller. And though the rope's mark would fade from her skin, the memory of the hand that cut it would remain, sharp and certain as the moment the air rushed back into her lungs.